His wife took the house, took the car, and drained every dollar from the bank account they had built together across 44 years of marriage. But in all her careful planning, in all the paperwork and courtroom victories and cold, calculated precision, Dorothy Greer forgot one thing. One small, weathered, completely overlooked thing. A tiny cabin sitting quiet and untouched in the Tennessee hills. A cabin his mother had left him. A cabin no attorney had ever found, no judge had ever named, and no signature had ever touched. Walter Greer was 71 years old the morning he stood on the curb outside the home his hands had maintained for 4 decades, holding 2 suitcases and a Bible with a small envelope tucked inside. His wife had the house. She had the car. She had the bank account. But as Walter's fingers closed around a single worn key inside that envelope, 3 words written on the front in his mother's handwriting stopped him cold. For starting over. And that is when Dorothy Greer made the one mistake that would cost her everything she thought she had won. But here is what nobody knew yet. Not Dorothy, not their son Clarence, not a single person who watched that marriage fall apart. What was inside that tiny cabin his mother left him? What had Edna Greer hidden there quietly, years before she died, as if she always knew this moment was coming? And when Dorothy finally discovered what she had forgotten, what would Walter say to the woman who took his house, his car, and his bank account, but left behind the one thing that would change everything? The morning it ended was a Tuesday. November, cold and gray, with a sky the color of old concrete pressing down over the neighborhood like a lid being sealed shut. Walter had been awake since 4, not because he couldn't sleep, but because some part of him had already said goodbye to the bedroom, to the ceiling he had stared at for 44 years, to the particular way the morning light came through the east window and fell across the floor. He lay there and memorized it, the way a man memorizes the face of someone he knows he will never see again. Dorothy moved through the house with the efficiency of someone who had already emotionally left months ago. She didn't slam doors. She didn't raise her voice. That was somehow worse. There is a cruelty and calmness when it comes from a person who once loved you, a calmness that says you no longer matter enough to be worth the energy of anger. She wore a pressed gray blouse and had her hair done. Walter noticed that. She had gotten her hair done the morning she was ending their marriage, and something about that small, groomed detail broke something open inside him that he couldn't name and couldn't close. The movers arrived at 8. 3 men who worked with the practiced silence of people, paid not to feel anything, carrying out furniture piece by piece, each item disappearing through the front door like words being erased from a sentence until the sentence meant nothing. The armchair Walter had reupholstered himself the winter Clarence was born. Gone. The oak sideboard he had built by hand as an anniversary gift in year 7 of their marriage, the one Dorothy had admired in a magazine and said she would love to have someday. Gone. Everything he had ever made with his hands, everything he had ever given her, loaded quietly onto a truck while the November air pushed dead leaves across the driveway. Walter stood in the kitchen doorway and watched it all go. He didn't fight it. There was no fight left in him that the courtroom hadn't already taken. Dorothy's attorney had been thorough, methodical, and quietly devastating. The house had been restructured under her name 18 months before she filed. The bank accounts moved. The financial picture redrawn so carefully that by the time Walter hired representation, the war was already over. His attorney had looked at him across a conference room table with the careful expression of a man delivering a terminal diagnosis and said, "Mr. Greer, I'm going to be honest with you. She planned this for a long time." Walter had nodded slowly. He already knew. Looking back, he could trace it now, the way Dorothy had changed 3 years ago. Not suddenly. The way a river changes course. Gradually, quietly, until one day you look up and the water is going somewhere entirely different and you can't remember exactly when it shifted. She had met someone, a man named Franklin Cole, polished and well-spoken, who wore his money like a second skin. And Dorothy, who had spent 4 decades in a modest house with a quiet furniture craftsman who showed love through what he built rather than what he said, had decided she deserved something that shone brighter. Walter hadn't been enough. That was the truth she never said directly, but had printed on every page of every legal document she filed. By 10 o'clock, the truck was loaded. By 10:15, Dorothy stood, near the front door in her coat, keys in hand, and looked across the empty living room at Walter with an expression that wasn't guilt and wasn't grief. It was something worse. It was relief. "The attorney's office will send you the final paperwork by end of week," she said. Her voice was the same voice that had once whispered to him in the dark, the same voice that had laughed at his jokes and called his name from the kitchen and told him she loved him on the porch on warm summer evenings. Now it held nothing, just information, just logistics. Walter looked at her for a long moment. 44 years, Dorothy," he said quietly. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked away, adjusting the strap of her bag on her shoulder. "You'll be fine, Walter," she said. "You're resilient." And then she walked out of the house. She didn't look back. The door didn't even slam. It closed with a soft final click that echoed through the empty rooms like the period at the end of a very long sentence. Walter stood alone in the hollow space that used to be his home, and the silence pressed in from every direction. His footsteps echoed on the bare floors as he walked slowly through each room one final time. The kitchen where he had made coffee every morning for 4 decades, the hallway where Clarence had learned to walk, one unsteady step at a time, arms stretched out toward Walter's waiting hands. The back bedroom where his mother had stayed the last Christmas she was well enough to travel, sitting up in bed with her Bible open on her lap and her reading glasses perched at the end of her nose. All of it hollow now, all of it someone else's. He picked up his 2 suitcases from the front hallway and carried them through the door, pulling it shut behind him. And he stood on the curb in the November cold with everything he had left in the world at his feet, and he reached into the front pocket of his coat and pulled out the small envelope he had carried with him since the morning after his mother's funeral, the one he had found tucked inside her Bible, sealed with his name written on the front in her steady, careful hand. He hadn't opened it then. He hadn't been able to. But standing here now, on the curb of a life that had just been emptied out, his fingers opened the envelope, slowly. Inside was a single brass key on a plain metal ring, worn smooth from years of being held, and folded beneath it a small piece of paper with 3 words written in his mother's handwriting. "For starting over." Walter stared at those words for a long time. The wind moved through the bare trees lining the street. A car passed without slowing. And somewhere deep in his chest, beneath the grief and the disbelief and the exhaustion of a year spent watching his life dismantle itself legally and quietly, something stirred. Something small. Something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He closed his fingers around the key until he could feel the worn edges, pressing into his palm. And then Walter Greer picked up his suitcases, turned away from the house that was no longer his, and began walking toward the one place Dorothy had never thought to take. Before we continue, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the notification bell. Because what Walter is about to find inside that tiny cabin is something Dorothy never knew existed. Stay with us. It is about to get very real. The last bus dropped Walter at the edge of a dirt road with no signpost, no marker, just a narrow gap in the tree line where the gravel ended and the earth took over. He stood there with a suitcase in each hand, staring up at the Tennessee Ridge, rising dark and quiet against the pale November sky. His knees ached, his back ached. Every reasonable part of him said, "Stop," but his mother's voice came back to him, quiet and plain, the way it always had been. "Walter James Greer, you were not built to quit." He picked up the suitcases and started walking. With every step, the world behind him faded. The highway, the town, Dorothy's gray blouse and careful eyes, all of it falling away until there was nothing left but wind through the oak branches and cold, clean air that smelled of pine and creek water and something his grief had no name for yet. He almost missed the cabin entirely. 40 years of absence had let the forest creep close, but then the path curved, the trees thinned, and there it was. Small, weathered, sitting on that ridge like it had been holding its breath, waiting for him to come back. The porch roof sagged, one step had rotted through, the windows were filmed with years of dust, but the walls stood straight, the chimney rose solid, and the bones were good. Walter stopped walking and just looked at it, and something moved through his chest that wasn't grief and wasn't relief, it was recognition. The deep, wordless kind that reaches back past memory, past thought, all the way to The boy who had run off that porch barefoot in the summer heat while his mother hummed through the screen door. "Mama," he whispered. The lock fought him, decades of rust and cold pushing back as if testing whether he truly meant to stay. Then, with a resistance that felt almost like a question being answered, it turned. The door swung open with a long, low creak that broke the silence of the ridge like a voice saying, "Welcome home." The air inside was cool and stale, but underneath the dust, faint and impossible, he could still smell the dried herbs his mother had always hung near the kitchen window. Still there, after all these years. Still there. Walter moved through the cabin slowly, pulled the sheet from the kitchen table, wiped a circle clean on the window glass and looked out at the valley below. Opened the back bedroom door. The quilt was still folded at the foot of the bed, every stitch still holding, and in the corner sat the cedar chest. He knelt in front of it, lifted the lid, and the smell of cedar rose up warm and clean. He looked inside, his grandfather's woodworking tools, every single one. Hand planes, chisels, a spokeshave, each wrapped individually in oiled cloth, preserved with a care that had nothing accidental about it. Tools Walter had assumed were lost decades ago. Tools he had stopped looking for the same way he had stopped making room for everything else he loved. His hands were shaking as he lifted one. Beneath the tools was an envelope, his name on the front, his mother's handwriting. He opened it. "Walter, if you are reading this, life brought you back here because it needed to. Your grandfather's tools are yours. They always were. Your hands know what to do with them. Trust that. And before you close this chest, look underneath the paper at the bottom." Walter set the letter down, reached into the chest, lifted the paper lining, and found a document he had never seen before. A property deed. A surveyor's contract. Dated 6 years back, bearing the seal of a Calverton land office. He unfolded it slowly, his eyes moving across the lines. The cabin sat on 11 acres of ridgeland with timber, creek access, and a freshwater spring, assessed at a market value that made him read the number twice, then a third time. Dorothy's attorneys had searched every account, every asset, every financial record attached to his name. But a property held quietly in a deceased woman's estate, never mentioned, never transferred, sitting silent on a Tennessee ridge. They had never found it. They had never even looked. Walter sat back on the old floorboards and stared at nothing for a long moment. Then he looked down at his grandfather's handplane, resting in his palms, at the tools around him, at the letter open on the quilt, at the deed that said 11 acres belonged to him and him alone. And for the first time, in longer than he could honestly remember, Walter Greer smiled. Not because everything was fine, everything was far from fine, but because for the first time in years, everything was his, and Dorothy had no idea. If this story has moved you even once, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the notification bell, because this is where everything changes. Don't go anywhere. Winter came to the ridge hard and fast, but Walter Greer did not sit still inside it. He fixed the cabin first, replaced the rotted step, straightened the sagging roof beam, sealed the walls, reset the wood stove flue. Every evening he sat under lamplight reading his mother's notebooks, preserving recipes, herbal remedies, practical knowledge built over a lifetime of making something from very little. Walter read every word like a man receiving instructions from someone who had loved him enough to prepare for a future she would never see. By January he was sleeping through the night. By February his hands had stopped shaking. By March he was back at the workbench. He started with fallen timber from the property, cedar mostly. One piece of white oak the storm had brought down across the creek path. Wasn't building for anyone in particular. He was building because his hands needed to remember who they were. The first finished piece was a rocking chair, built from the fallen oak, joined entirely by hand, not a single nail. He put it on the porch. 3 days later, a truck slowed on the dirt road below. A woman climbed out, broad-shouldered, unhurried, comfortable on uneven ground. She walked straight up to the porch and looked at the rocking chair with the focused attention of someone who recognizes quality without being told. Her name was Hattie Bowman, 64, widow, ran the general store and postal route out of Calverton 12 miles down the mountain. She looked at the chair, then at Walter. "You make that?" "I did," he said. $400, cash, right now." Walter looked at her steadily. $450. Hattie smiled for the first time. "Done." She came back 2 weeks later with 3 names, people in Calverton who had heard about the chair and wanted to talk to the man who built it. Word spread the way it only spreads in small towns, not through advertising, through trust. By May, Walter had 6 orders backed up. By midsummer, his mother's garden was running green along the south wall, tomatoes, beans, herbs, squash, all of it guided by her notebooks. The freshwater spring on the eastern edge of the property flowing cold and clean into the stone basin his grandfather had built before Walter was born. He wasn't rich, but every dollar was his. Every meal came from his land or his labor, and every morning the first feeling that arrived was not dread. It was peace. Then August came, and with it a car Walter didn't recognize moving slow up the dirt road. He set down his chisel and walked to the shed door. When the driver stepped out, Walter felt something move through him, not anger, not fear, just a long, slow breath of recognition. Dorothy. She looked uncertain in a way she had never been. Her heels were wrong, for the dirt road. She picked her way across the ground carefully and stopped at the edge of the property, looking around at the cabin, the garden, the shed, the sign near the path that read, "Greer Custom Woodwork, by order only." Something moved across her face. She recovered from it quickly, but not quickly enough. Walter walked out and stopped a few feet in front of her. "Dorothy." "Walter." The hesitation in her voice was new. "The house has foundation problems, 43,000 in repairs, Franklin's." She paused. Things changed. Walter said nothing. "I thought maybe we could talk," she said. "Figure something out." The August air moved warm through the oaks overhead, and Walter looked at the woman he had spent 44 years loving and building for, and felt something he hadn't expected. Not bitterness, not triumph, just clarity. Clean and final, like creek water over stone. "You took the house, Dorothy," he said quietly. She held his gaze. "I know. You took the car, the bank account. 44 years. He let that sit. You took everything you could see." He looked out slowly, at the cabin, the garden, the shed, the 11 acres of ridgeland that belonged to him and him alone, then back at her. "But you forgot the one thing that was never yours to take." The silence that followed was heavier than anything in 44 years of marriage. He reached into his shirt pocket and held out a small piece of paper, his attorney's address in Calverton. "Any further conversations go through him," Walter said calmly. "Take care of yourself, Dorothy." Her own words, said back to her on a warm August afternoon, but meaning something entirely different now. Dorothy took the paper. She looked at Walter one last time, really looked at him, and something crossed her face that might have been the first honest thing she had felt in years. Then she turned and walked back down the dirt path without a word. Walter watched her go. Then he turned, climbed the porch steps, every one of them solid now, rebuilt by his own hands, and sat down in the rocking chair built from a fallen oak on the land his mother had left him. He picked up her letter from the side table, worn soft at the folds now from being read so many times. He didn't read it tonight. He just held it, because he finally understood what Edna Greer had always known, what she had quietly protected and preserved through all the years he had spent giving himself away. Walter James Greer was not a man defined by what was taken from him. He was a man defined by what he could build, and he was just getting started. Dorothy got the house, the car, the bank account, but the freshwater spring on the eastern edge of 11 Tennessee acres was assessed 18 months later at a conservation value that made Walter's original savings look like pocket change. She never knew, she never asked, and Walter Greer never told her. Some things are better left exactly where they are, hidden, quiet, and entirely yours. If Walter's story touched something real in you, subscribe right now and turn on that notification bell. Every week this channel brings you stories exactly like this one. Stories about real loss, real resilience, and the quiet truth that what life takes from you is never the whole story. Subscribe, turn on that bell, and we will see you in the next one.